We continue Caius Marius from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Marius, thus employed, and thus winning the affections of the soldiers, before long filled both Africa and Rome with his fame, and some, too, wrote home from the army that the war with Africa would never be brought to a conclusion unless they chose Caius Marius consul, all which was evidently unpleasing to Metellus, but what more especially grieved him was the calamity of Turpilius. This Turpilius had, from his ancestors, been a friend of Metellus, and kept up a constant hospitality with him, and was now serving in the war in command of the smiths and carpenters of the army. Having the charge of a garrison in Vaga, a considerable city, and trusting too much to the inhabitants, because he treated them civilly and kindly. Well, you can treat people civilly and kindly without trusting them too much with stuff. He unawares fell into the enemy's hands. They received Jugurtha into the city, yet nevertheless, at the request, Turpilius was dismissed safe and without receiving any injury, whereupon he was accused of betraying it to the enemy. Marius, being one of the council of war, was not only violent against himself, but also incensed most of the others, so that Metellus was forced, much against his will, to put him to death. Not long after the accusation proved false, and when others were comforting Metellus, who took heavily the loss of his friend, Marius, rather insulting and arrogating it to himself, boasted in all companies that he had involved Metellus in the guilt of putting his friend to death. Yeah, if you don't know, you don't know. And I'm not talking about, like O.J. Simpson blacking out in a rage and waking up with blood on him and dead bodies. That's not, that's not the type of I don't remember killing them. Well, it's pretty obvious he did, but if they said, well, he could have done this, but we don't have any knowledge of it. And I don't know if it could have been proved false, just perhaps that they don't have any knowledge of him actually betraying. Henceforth, they were at open variance. And it is reported that Metellus once, when Marius was present, said insultingly, "You, sir, designed to leave us to go home and stand for the consulship, and will not be content to wait and be consul with this boy of mine," Metellus' son being a mere boy at the time. Yet, for all this, Marius being very importunate to be gone after several delays, he was dismissed about 12 days before the election of the consuls, and performed that long journey from camp to the seaport of Utica in 2 days and a night, and there doing sacrifice before he went on shipboard. It is said the augur told him that heaven promised him some incredible good fortune, and such was beyond all expectation. Marius, not a little elated with his good omen, began his voyage, and in 4 days, with a favorable wind, passed the sea. He was welcomed with great joy by the people, and being brought into the assembly by one of the tribunes, sued for the consulship, inveighing in all ways against Metellus, and promising either to slay Jugurtha or to take him alive. He was elected triumphantly, and at once proceeded to levy soldiers, contrary to both the law and custom, enlisting slaves and poor people, whereas former commanders never accepted of such, but bestowed arms like other favors, as a matter of distinction on persons who had proper qualification, a man's property being thus a sort of security for his good behavior. These were not the only occasions of ill will against Marius. Some haughty speeches, uttered with great arrogance and contempt, gave great offense to the nobility, as, for example, his saying that he had carried off the consulship as a spoil from the effeminacy of the wealthy and high-born citizens, and telling the people that he gloried in wounds he had himself received for them, as much as others did in the monuments of dead men and images of their ancestors, often speaking of the commanders that had been unfortunate in Africa, naming Bestia, for example, and Albinus, men of very good families, but unfit for war, who had miscarried through want of experience. He asked the people about him if they did not think that the ancestors of these nobles had much rather had left a descendant like him, since they themselves grew famous not by nobility, but by their valor and great actions. This he did not say merely out of vanity and arrogance, or that he were willing, without any advantage, to offend the nobility, but the people always delighting in affronts and scurrilous contumelies against the Senate, making boldness of speech their measure of greatness of spirit, continually encouraged him in it, and strengthened his inclination not to spare persons of repute, so he might gratify the multitude. As soon as he arrived again in Africa, Metellus, no longer able to control his feelings of jealousy and his indignation that now when he had really finished the war was nothing left but to secure the person of Jugurtha, Marius, grown great merely through his ingratitude to him, should come to bereave him both of his victory and triumph, could not bear to have any interview with him, but retired himself, while Rutilius, his lieutenant, surrendered up the army to Marius, whose conduct, however, in the end of the war, met with some sort of retribution, as Sulla deprived him of the glory of the action, as he had done Metellus. I shall state the circumstances briefly here, as they are given in large in the life of Sulla. Bacchus was king of the more distant barbarians, and was father-in-law to Jugurtha. He sent him little or no assistance in the war, professing fears of his unfaithfulness, and really jealous of his last hope. He received him as a suppliant, rather because ashamed to do otherwise, than out of real kindness, and when he had him in his power, he openly entreated Marius on his behalf, and interceded for him with bold words, giving out that he would by no means deliver him, yet privately designing to betray him, he sent for Lucius Sulla, quaestor to Marius, and who had on a previous occasion befriended Bacchus in the war. When Sulla, relying on his word, came to him, the African began to doubt and repent of his purpose, and for several days was unresolved with himself whether he should deliver Jugurtha or retain Sulla. At length he fixed upon his former treachery, and put Jugurtha alive into Sulla's possession. Thus was the first occasion given of that fierce and implacable hostility which so nearly ruined the whole Roman Empire, for many that envied Marius attributed the success wholly to Sulla, and Sulla himself got a seal made, on which was engraved Bacchus betraying Jugurtha to him, and constantly used it, irritating the hot and jealous temper of Marius, who was naturally greedy of distinction, and quick to resent any claim to share in glory, and whose enemies took care to promote the quarrel, ascribing the beginning and chief business of the war to Metellus, and its conclusion to Sulla, so that the people might give over admiring and esteeming Marius as the worthiest person. But these envyings and calumnies were soon dispersed and cleared away from Marius by the danger that threatened Italy from the west, when the city, in great need of a good commander, sought out whom she might set at helm to meet the tempest of so great a war. No one would have anything to say to any members of the noble or potent families who offered themselves for the consulship, and Marius, though then absent, was elected. Jugurtha's apprehension was only just known when the news of the invasion of the Teutons and Cimbri began. One of the names for northwestern Europeans has become the Teutonic people, but just like Celts and others, it's kind of originally more a more specific area, right? The accounts at first exceeded all credit as to the number and strength of the approaching army, but in the end report proves much inferior to truth, as they were 300,000 effective fighting men, besides a far greater number of women and children. They professed to be seeking new countries to sustain these great multitudes and cities where they might settle and inhabit, in the same way as they had heard the Celti before them had driven out the Tyrrhenians and possessed themselves of the best part of Italy, having had no commerce with the southern nations, and traveling over a wide extent of country. No man knew what people they were, or whence they came, that thus, like a cloud burst over Gaul and Italy, yet by their grey eyes and largeness of their stature, they were conjectured to be some of the German races dwelling by the northern sea. So, the Norse. Besides that, the Germans call plunderers Cimbri. There are some that say that the country of the Celti, in its vast size and extent, reaches from the furthest sea and the Arctic regions to the lake Maeotis eastwards, and to that part of Scythia which is near Pontus. And first, there the nations mingled together, that they did not swarm out of their country all at once or on a sudden, but advancing by force of arms in the summer season, every year, in course of time, they crossed the whole continent, and thus, through each party, had several appellations, yet the whole army was called by the common name of Celto-Scythians. Others say that Cimmeriae, anciently known to the Greeks, were only a small part of the nation, who were driven out upon some quarrel among the Scythians, and passed all along from the lake Maeotis to Asia under the conduct of one Bagdamis, and that the greater and a more warlike part of them still inhabited the remotest regions lying upon the outer ocean. Now, we find that the Hyperboreans, the Slavic race, people call them the Sakas, the Gog and Magog. Just like the Celts weren't one people, they were a bunch of peoples as a group. So, Magog, the Slavic people from the steppes of Asia, and Gog, the Mongolians, Tibetans, and that sort of thing. And yeah, it tended to be one. Not all the tribes at once tended to be the thing. And over time, for example, out of Moscow, which was one of the centers that, over 2,000 years ago was talked about. It was one. Eventually, most of the tribes kind of became part of Russia. And I don't mean the USSR, where they kept their identities. I mean, became some sort of ancient thing that, back in the day, those who knew, but it's not like, they had some national or tribal identity that people tended to know other than Russian. These, they say, live in a dark and woody country, hardly penetrable by the sunbeams. The trees are so close and thick, extending into the interior as far as the Hercynian forest, and their position on earth is under that part of heaven where the pole is so elevated that by the declination of the parallels the zenith of the inhabitants seems to be but little distant from it, and that their days and nights being almost of an equal length, they divide their year into one of each. This was, well, a bit of an exaggeration, but, this was Homer's occasion for the story of Ulysses calling up the dead, and from this region the people, anciently called Cimmeriae, and afterwards, by an easy change, Cimbri, came into Italy. All this, however, is rather conjecture than an authentic history. Because the Greco-Roman idea of this is a little bit more vague than more sacred history-based things. Actually kind of preserve it a little bit better, and you can follow the physical traits and stuff like this. Their numbers, most writers agree, were not less, but rather greater than was reported. They were of invincible strength and fierceness in their wars, and hurried into battle with the violence of a devouring flame. None could withstand them. All they assaulted became their prey. Several of the greatest Roman commanders, with their whole armies that advanced for the defense of Transalpine Gaul, were ingloriously overthrown, and indeed by their faint resistance chiefly gave them the impulse of marching towards Rome. Having vanquished all they met, and found abundance of plunder, they resolved to settle themselves nowhere till they should have razed the city and wasted all Italy. The Romans, being from all parts alarmed with this news, sent for Marius to undertake the war, and nominated him the second time consul, though the law did not permit any one that was absent, or that had not waited a certain time after his first consulship, to be again created. But the people rejected all opposers, for they considered this was not the first time that the law gave place to the common interest, nor the present occasion less urgent than that when, contrary to law, they made Scipio consul, not in fear for the destruction of their own city, but desiring the ruin of the Carthaginians. Thus it was decided, and Marius, bringing over his legions out of Africa on the very first day of January, which the Romans count the beginning of the year, received the consulship, then also entered in triumph, showing Jugurtha a prisoner to the people, a sight they had been despaired of ever beholding, nor could any, so long as he lived, hope to reduce the enemy in Africa. So fertile in expedients was he to adapt himself to every turn of fortune, and so bold as well as subtle, when, however, he was led in triumph. It is said that he fell distracted, and when he was afterwards thrown into prison, where some tore off his clothes by force, at others, whilst they struggled for his golden earring, with it pulled off the tip of his ear, and when he was, after this, cast naked into the dungeon, in his amazement and confusion, with a ghastly laugh, he cried out, "O Hercules, how cold your bath is! Here for 6 days, struggling with hunger, and to the very last minute, delirious of life, he was overtaken by the just reward of his villainies, and this triumph was brought, as is stated, of gold 3,007 pounds weight, of silver bullion 5,775, of money, in gold and silver coin 287,000 drachmas." After the solemnity, Marius, there wasn't a line at that there, called together the Senate in the Capitol, and entered, whether through inadvertency or unbecoming exultation, his good fortune in his triumphal habit, but presently observing the Senate offended at it, went out, and returned in his ordinary purple-bordered robe. On the expedition, he carefully disciplined and trained his army whilst they were on their way, giving them practice in long marches and running of every sort, and compelling every man to carry his own baggage and prepare his own victuals, insomuch that thenceforward laborious soldiers, who did their work silently without grumbling, had the name of Marius's mules. Some, however, think the proverb had a different occasion, that when Scipio besieged Numantia, and was careful to inspect not only their horses and arms, but their mules and carriages too, and see how well equipped and in what readiness each one was, Marius brought forth his horse, which he had fed extremely well, and a mule in better case, stronger and gentler than those of others, that the general was very well pleased, and often afterwards mentioned Marius's beasts, and that hence the soldiers, when speaking jestingly in the praise of a drudging, laborious fellow, called him Marius's mule. But to proceed, very great fortune seemed to attend Marius, for by the enemy in a manner changing their course, and falling first upon Spain, he had time to exercise his soldiers, and confirm their courage, and which was most important, to show them what he himself was, for that fierce manner of his in command and inexorableness in punishing, when his men became used not to do amiss or disobey, was felt to be wholesome and advantageous, as well as just, and his violent spirit, stern voice, and harsh aspect, which in a little while grew familiar to them, they esteemed terrible, not to themselves, but only to their enemies. But his uprightness in judging more especially pleased the soldiers, one remarkable instance of which is as follows. When Caius Lucius, his own nephew, had a command under him in the army, a man not in other respects a bad character, but shamefully licentious with young men, he had, well, maybe he wasn't ashamed of it, he had one young man under his command called Trebonius, with whom, notwithstanding many solicitations, he could never prevail. Well, at least he allowed for consent, right? At length, one night, he sent a messenger for him, and Trebonius came, as it was not lawful for him to refuse when he was sent for, and being brought into his tent, when Lucius began to use violence with him, he drew his sword and ran him through. This was done whilst Marius was absent. When he returned, he appointed Trebonius a time for his trial, where, whilst many accused him, and not any one appeared in his defense, he himself boldly related the whole matter, and brought witness of his previous conduct to Lucius, who had frequently offered him considerable presents. Marius, admiring his conduct, and much pleased, commanded the garland, the usual Roman reward of valor, to be brought, and himself crowned Trebonius with it, as having performed an excellent action, and a time that very much wanted such good examples. We need to put more of these cases on the news, right? But really, leave it up. The government should be taking care of these people. Thank you very much. I criticize the government for not, This being told at Rome proved no small help to Marius towards his third consulship, to which also conducted the expectation of the barbarians at the summer season, the people being unwilling to trust their fortunes with any other general but him. However, their arrival was not so early as was imagined, and the time of Marius's consulship was again expired, the election coming on, and his colleague being dead, he left the command of the army to Manius Aquilius, and hastened to Rome, where several eminent persons, being candidates for the consulship, Lucius Saturninus, who, more than any of the other tribunes, swayed the populace, and of whom Marius himself was very observant, exerted his eloquence with the people, advising them to choose Marius consul. He played the modest part in professing to decline the office. Saturninus called him traitor to his country if, in such apparent danger, he would avoid command, and though it was not difficult to discover that he was merely helping Marius in putting this pretense upon the people, yet considering that the present juncture much required his skill and his good fortunes too, they voted him the third time consul, and made Caius Lutatius his colleague, a man very much esteemed by the nobility and not unagreeable to the commons. Marius, having notice of the enemy's approach, with all expedition, passed the Alps, and pitching his camp by the river Rhone, took care first for the plentiful supplies of victuals, lest at any time he should be forced to fight at a disadvantage for want of necessaries. The carriage of provision for the army from the sea, which was formerly long and expensive, he made speedy and easy. For the mouth of the Rhone, by the influx of the sea being barred and almost filled up with sand and mud mixed with clay, the passage there became narrow, difficult, and dangerous for the ships that brought their provisions hither. Therefore, bringing his army, then at leisure, he drew a great trench, and by turning the course of a great part of the river, brought it to a convenient point on the shore where the water was deep enough to receive ships of considerable burden, and where there was a calm and easy opening to the sea. And this still retains the name it took from him. The enemy, dividing themselves into two parts, the Cimbri arranged to go against Catullus higher up through the country of the Nordici, and to force that passage. The Teutons and Ambrones to march against Marius. I don't have Greek characters here or whatever, so by the seaside through Liguria, the Cimbri were a considerable time in doing their part, but the Teutons and the Ambrones, with all expedition, passing over the interjacent country, soon came in sight, in numbers beyond belief, of a terrible aspect, with uttering strange cries and shouts, taking up a great part of the plain with their camp. They challenged Marius to a battle. He seemed to take no notice of them, but kept his soldiers within their fortifications, and sharply reprehended those that were too forward and eager to show their courage, and who, out of passion, would needs be fighting, calling them traitors to their country, and telling them they were not now to think of the glory and triumphs and trophies, but rather how they might repel such an impetuous tempest of war and save Italy. Thus he discoursed privately with his officers and equals, but placed the soldiers by turns upon bulwarks to survey the enemy, and so made them familiar with their shape and voice, which were indeed altogether extravagant and barbarous, and he caused them to observe their arms and the way of using them, so that in a little time what at first appeared terrible to their apprehensions, by often viewing them became familiar, for he very rationally supposed that the strangeness of things often makes them seem formidable when they are not so, and that by our better acquaintance even things which are really terrible lose much of their frightfulness. This daily converse not only diminished some of their soldiers' fears, but their indignation warmed and inflamed their courage when they heard the threats and insupportable insolence of their enemies, who not only plundered and depopulated all the country round, but would even contemptuously and confidently attack the ramparts.